Okay, Hare Krishna, everybody. Welcome. Just waiting for it to start streaming. Oh, I think it's streaming now. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So we'll start with Mangalacharan prayers, as always. Om Jnana Timirandasya Yananjana Shalakaya Chakshurum Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Siddhantodpalasara Nityarasikang Hang Sang Vilasatmakang Audaryakya Siddhama Sevakadanam Vishramba Bhakti Pradam Yakya Yukti Vichakshanam Bhagavedo Vaishishta Shakya Sada Vandehang Chakarari Namakayating Sri Bhakti Vedantinam Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Ajanulambita Bhujao Kanakavatao Sankirtanaika Pitarao Kamalaya Taksho Vishwambarao Dijavarao Yukadharma Palao Vande Jagapriyakaro Karunavataro Vande Shri Krishna Chaitanya Nityananda Sodito Godadaye Pushpavanto Chitro Shando Tamonudao Vandeham Shri Ramakrishna Abhaya Charana Sukho Sukhato Paramanando Sundaro Subalo Priyo He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandhu Jagapate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gorangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vandana Korite Mui Kata Shakti Dari Tamo Buddhido Shemui Damba Matra Kori Tatapi Mukera Bhagya Manero Ulas Doshak Shami Modame Koroni Jadas. So Hare Krishna, everybody. So we'll just do a really brief summary of last time, just to get us back into the flow of where we're at and what we discussed last time. So we were discussing the importance of the text Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu and how it really points us towards refining our desires. So we see this is the case with both the Gita and the Bhagavatam in various ways. And so we were making the point that at our essence, we're desiring beings. We're units of will, sometimes put like that, right? we like to desire. So we know also we discussed bhakti a little bit, and we know that any contact with bhakti is so powerful. So we discussed Dhruva Maharaj a little bit. We know bhakti can grant so many things, but Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu, which is the focus of this series, its thesis or driving verse, it tells us, Anyabhilashita shunyang yanakrama janavritam anukuyena krishnanu shilanam bhaktir uttama, which means the highest bhakti is defined as continuous service or emotions directed towards Krishna, his expansion forms, or others related to him, with a pleasing attitude towards Krishna. It should be devoid of desires other than the desire to please the Lord, and unobstructed by impersonal jnana, the materialistic rituals of karma, or other unfavorable acts. So we might read that and think, I may as well close the book now, if the rest of the book's about this verse. But we were making the point that to even have a sense of prema bhakti, which is our goal, to have a sense of prema bhakti being our goal, and that bhakti herself is the way to attain that goal, to being touched by bhakti in some way, in this way, uttama bhakti, as I'm sure anyone hearing these talks has been, then we have an invitation, so to speak. So it's true that we might have other interests or desires in our heart as well. So although in the context of uttama bhakti, the entire context, we may be far from being pure devotees in the strictest sense of the term. But if prema is our goal or our practice, as it likely is for anyone deeply touched by Mahaprabhu's mission, even if we don't have a full understanding of what prema means, just maybe we refine that understanding as we go along, of course. But then we're students of uttama bhakti and not any other type of yoga. We're not students of any other type of yoga or any other type of bhakti. So what we're going to be exploring for the rest of this series is refining our own intention behind the practice to come closer to this ideal. And this whole book actually helps us in that direction, and the subsidiary books that explain it also. So ultimately, the Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu says that our sadhana should lead us toward bhava. It should produce bhava, actually, before maturing into prema. But as we know, there are many stages before that, many stages in sadhana or practice. And so the sub-goal for many of us is nishta, or the stage of steady, uninterrupted practice, where our material conditioning no longer distracts us and we can maintain a constant intensity. As I'm sure many of you may have experienced, sometimes we can get distracted in different ways, even though we are trying hard to practice. So this stage of nishta is where even with whatever material conditioning we have, it no longer distracts us. So we have this constant intensity, and our practice is driven by spiritual intelligence. And of course, this will lead to ruchi, where material desires are pretty much, if not fully, retired. So before that, if we've taken up this path, it might not mean that our other desires will instantly vanish, hence why there are these other stages. But they won't become a covering on our practice because we're practicing to fulfill them. Sorry, we're not practicing. I hope that's not a Freudian slip, but we aren't practicing to fulfill them, but rather to cleanse them or redirect them, at least until we're in the higher stages of sadhana bhakti. So that's really what the rest of this series is going to be about. So on that, today's topic, main topic is are we qualified? So I guess a question to ask is, if I'm saying we are qualified to practice, be students of this school of Uttama Bhakti, were we qualified as being students of Uttama Bhakti from day one? After we had the good fortune, whether we came in contact with a devotee, maybe directly or indirectly, or however, we've all got our stories of how we came to bhakti. And I'd argue that it's not necessarily the case that we're qualified as students of Uttama Bhakti from day one, but as with many, many things in spiritual life, the potential is there. So what does it mean to be qualified to practice Uttama Bhakti? So the verses we're going to read today, we're going to read a series of verses from the second wave, or the second chapter of Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu. And so this verse is verse 14 in the second wave. So this is the translation. The qualified candidate is described as follows: the person who has developed faith in serving the Lord by the impressions arising from previous association with devotees, who is not too attached to material objects, and who is not too detached, is qualified for Vaidhi Bhakti. So as a side note, before we get into the actual topic at hand, just to maybe clear up for anybody who might be a bit confused with this term Vaidhi Bhakti. So Vaidhi Bhakti, as we know, it is like the practice that's driven by scriptural regulations like this. But Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, as many of you are aware, I'm sure, he really emphasized Rag Bhakti or Raganuga Bhakti. And so I want to clarify in the context of our studies something for those who might not be aware, that as I say, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's school emphasizes Raganuga Bhakti. And the likelihood is for anyone hearing this, or even studying Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu in general, obviously there's exceptions, of course, always, but our ideal is Vraj or Vrindavan. Often we hear so much about Vrindavan, right? Whereas the ideal of Vaikuntha, the Vaikuntha planets, this is attained by Vaidhi Bhakti, which is also a path unto itself, or devotion, as I say, governed by scripture as a path. Whereas in Raganuga Bhakti, it's driven by a taste, or a greed for a taste, a specific taste. So that said, however, until our material desires are retired in the stage of ruchi or taste, then the process is very similar for both Vaidhi and Raganuga. So both paths of Vaidhi, Bhakti, and Raganuga, very similar, except, as I say, the ideal is different in that we emphasize Vrindavan. So both paths, something very important to understand is that both paths, whatever the destination or our ideal is, are both considered under Uttama Bhakti. So there's this idea of pure Bhakti or Uttama Bhakti, because both paths strive to fully embody this 1.111 verse in desiring to please Krishna in the fullest sense according to our potential to do so. So obviously, you know, in one sense, Srimati Radharani is the only one who can please Krishna in the fullest sense, but we've all got potential to please Krishna as being part of that, you could say, in different ways. Obviously, that's different in different schools. But so, some of you will be aware that Jiva Goswami, he very graciously gave us a position on this path even before we're free of our material desires. So he uses this term ajata ruchi raganuga bhakti, or raganuga bhakti without taste. So what that means is that we still have taste for so many material things. At least speaking personally, we've got taste for many material things, but somewhere in our hearts, amongst all the clutter, we know that we want to strive for this mood of Vrindavan, even if we don't have full eagerness or the full greed that Raganuga Sadhana Bhakti is really embodied by. So later acharyas, after Jiva Goswami, such as Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, and Srila Prabhupada following after them, they've used this term Vaidhi Bhakti in quite a general way often in their writings to distinguish the stage of our path where we embrace the practices of Vaidhi Bhakti so we can attain greater eligibility to practice Raganuga Bhakti, even Raganuga Sadhana Bhakti in the fullest sense. And even in higher stages, it should be noted that it embraces Vaidhi Bhakti, practices of Vaidhi Bhakti, but with a different internal motivation. So much could be said on these topics, but for the purpose of this series, the main reason I bring these points up is that many of the verses we're going to read refer to Vaidhi Bhakti because it's in a section on Vaidhi Bhakti. But we should understand that they're valid for anyone on the path of Uttama Bhakti, no matter one's spiritual ideal in the ultimate sense. So whether one has a Vaidhi orientation or a Rag orientation, these verses, they apply to all actually. Going back to the main topic at hand, are we qualified from day one? So again, I'll read this verse. What does it mean to be qualified to practice Uttama Bhakti? The qualified candidate is described as follows: the person who has developed faith in serving the Lord by the impressions arising from previous association with devotees, who is not too attached to material objects, and who is not too detached, is qualified for Vaidhi Bhakti. So Rupa Goswami also gives a really nice verse from the Bhagavatam to support this. He gives this verse from the 11th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, 11:28, where it says, if somehow or other, by good fortune, one develops faith in hearing and chanting my glories, such a person, being neither very disgusted with nor attached to material life, should achieve perfection through the path of loving devotion to me. So I said it's not necessarily the case we were qualified as students of Uttama Bhakti from day one, but I'm also claiming that most of us, if not all, and any serious and sincere devotee in Lord Chaitanya's school, no matter the amount of their material conditioning, are considered to be students of Uttama Bhakti. So in the beginning, we might have come to a kirtan or a lecture or some kind of program, but with no faith whatsoever of serving Krishna. Maybe we didn't even have a conception whatsoever of Krishna either. But early on in our practice, by associating with devotees, we start to learn that actually when we're chanting, we're asking for service to Krishna, and actually that even the chanting itself is a service. So although this conception isn't fully refined from day one, by the time one's become a little serious about the path, the likelihood is that there is a conception that all these limbs of bhakti or practices of bhakti, they're all about serving Krishna. So Chaitanya's school is all about that. So in one sense, we've been touched by that conception, and every person in the school has been. And so to the degree that we embrace that conception, that's the degree to which we're in this school of Uttama Bhakti. So we might bunk off from school from time to time, unfortunately, but hopefully we keep coming back to this focus of Uttama Bhakti. And so Rupa Goswami, he goes on to elaborate on different types of devotees qualified for Uttama Bhakti. So he gives 3 types of devotees. So these are verses 16 to 19. He says, there are 3 types of persons qualified for Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti: Uttama Adhikari, Madhyama Adhikari, and Kanishta Adhikari. The Uttama Adhikari is defined as follows: the person who is skillful in scripture and logic, completely firm in his belief, with deep faith, is considered qualified as Uttama in Vaidhi Bhakti. The Madhyama Adhikari is defined as follows: the person who is not fully conversant with the scriptures, like the Uttama Adhikari, but has firm conviction in them, is known as Madhyama Adhikari. The definition of Kanishta Adhikari is as follows: he who has weak faith because of even less knowledge of the scriptures than the Madhyama Adhikari is called the Kanishta. Now, a whole series could be done on going deeply into these 3 types of devotees and different ways. Sometimes they're defined, sometimes different acharyas define them in different ways, depending on the context. But I think as a side note, it's important to note that in this context, Rupa Goswami is defining them by the depth of their faith and their understanding of the scripture on a deep level, not just memorizing, but the ability to think through the logic of the scripture. You might have heard of this term, Shastra Yukti. So also, I guess an important kind of side note is that all 3 of these are included in defining who is qualified for sadhana bhakti. We're not talking about bhava bhakti here. The next chapter is about bhava bhakti. So this is about sadhana bhakti. And so he's defining these 3 types of people or devotees who are qualified. So for the context of this series now, I want to read the next verse that will help me make the point I want to make regarding our qualification, even for Uttama Bhakti, that at least we're Kanishta Adhikaris in the way Rupa Goswami is defining Adhikaris here. So in verses 1 to 20 to 1 to 21, he says, among the 4 types of persons qualified for Bhakti mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita, when they receive the mercy of the Lord or his devotee and eradicate those tendencies, they become qualified for pure bhakti. Examples of this are Gajendra, Shaunaka and the sages, Dhruva, and also the 4 Kumaras. So, as we were discussing last week, and I'm sure we're all very familiar and have heard this many times, bhakti is extremely powerful. And any contact with her is extremely beneficial, even in mixed forms. But those type of bhakti are not the bhakti that Lord Chaitanya is giving in the fullest sense. And they won't lead to prema in and of themselves, practicing that kind of mixed bhakti. It's not that anyone who's had some contact with bhakti is guaranteed to reach such a high goal as prema, although the potential is there. But only by practicing this Uttama Bhakti can it lead one to such a prospect. So Rupa Goswami, he's pointing out that even those touched by bhakti who have mixed motivations, if they can refine their desire by the mercy of the devotees or by Krishna himself, then they can also come to this Uttama Bhakti. So in this verse, he's referring to this famous verse in the Gita. I'm sure you're mostly familiar with, in verse 7:16, where Krishna discusses the 4 types of persons that take shelter of him, and he says they're all glorious or magnanimous souls, so I think this quite, as another side note, lots of side notes, but it's quite an important point that all devotees, anyone who approaches Krishna should be seen as glorious and respected. But he makes the point, he makes the point of the 4 types of devotees. He said, those who are in distress, those who are inquisitive, those who are seeking some material wealth, and those who desire to gain knowledge of the absolute. So the examples Rupa Goswami is given here, a Gajendra, who you may be familiar in the Bhagavatam, he was the elephant who was being eaten by the crocodile, right? And he wanted relief from that suffering. So he approached the Lord to be relieved from that suffering of being attacked by the crocodile. And when he saw the Lord, when the Lord came to save him, he saw the Lord and he was so charmed upon seeing Krishna or Vishnu, in that case, Narayan. And so similarly, the sages, such as Shaunaka, they're given as an example of the inquisitive devotee. So they were quite inquisitive into the nature of the world, and especially of heaven, Svargaloka, and how to attain it. So they heard from the devotee Sutta Goswami, who, as we know, spoke the Bhagavatam to them, he himself having heard it from Shukadev Goswami. And then we spoke a bit about Dhruva Maharaj last week, and we know that he wanted to attain a kingdom. That was his desire, but he was captivated by Narayan upon seeing him and achieving his goal, and later went on to develop pure bhakti. And the 4 Kumaras, the others who also were captivated by Narayan, even though initially they were desiring moksha or liberation. So we may also have experience of this, right? That we have experience in one of these, that maybe the first time we came to a program, it was because we were suffering or we were inquisitive, or the first time we picked up a book, or whatever it was. Here at our local programs, here we have kirtan programs and different kinds of katha programs. And so we see many people that come to the kirtans, often it's because they're suffering in some way and they're seeking relief from the sometimes harsh nature of the material world. Even they come without any understanding of what it is we're doing. Or some people, they may come because they're inquisitive, but they're curious about what are these Hare Krishna people all about. But they don't have much faith in the concept of a supreme being, or maybe they don't even have a concept of a supreme being. What to speak of serving him? There's this isn't there for them. But we find those who stick around, they hear more, read the books. The captivating nature of Krishna pulls, as we know ourselves, pulls us further and further into higher motivations in that direction. So I would argue that it's not the case that someone's qualified for Uttama Bhakti just by having come in touch with devotees or bhakti literature or however it is. Of course, though, that's extremely beneficial. But because if someone's practicing even the limbs of Uttama Bhakti, such as kirtan, but they have an ulterior motivation, if someone's doing their kirtan, but they're thinking, oh, I really want a castle, as you said last week, or whatever it is, then they would be included in these, they wouldn't be included in these 3 types of devotees qualified for Uttama Bhakti, but they would come under this verse of the Gita. If they're approaching Krishna for something, they'd come under this verse of the Gita of the 4 types of devotees that approach Krishna. But when someone, by the grace of previous impressions, so maybe from previous lifetimes, or from hearing from saintly people, or studying the scripture, or the grace of Krishna himself, they decide this is my goal in life, is to serve Krishna, and they have that faith or sense that bhakti is the way to do that, then they're qualified, even if that understanding's not yet been refined, and we have some work to do in terms of cleansing the heart so that we can do so steadily. So as we've discussed, we may certainly, even maybe having that conception, we may certainly still have material desires, even if they're subtle. And we might not be fully focused on our practice at all times. We might have unsteady practice, anishta bhajana kriya. So can we be so bold to call ourselves Kanishta Adhikaris, understanding even someone like Dhruva Maharaj wasn't qualified at that point for Uttama Bhakti until he'd attained darshan of Vishnu and kind of, given up that initial drive and received Vishnu's mercy? And I'd say yes. I've sometimes heard our Guru Maharaj make the point that Kanishta or neophyte is a category that's been very mercifully created for us. After all, this bhakti given by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, we know Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the most munificent incarnation of Krishna, right? Or Krishna himself actually in his most munificent mood, let's say. So this bhakti given by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu reaches down to the most low and takes them to the most high, as we know. So as I said last week, what one isn't practicing to attain a kingdom or even to reduce their suffering, even though that might have been there in the early stages of coming into contact with bhakti. So there are many things that could be said about what makes a Kanishta differ from a mixed devotee. But in the interest of time, the main point, I guess, to bring out that, it's one of motivation of practice. So what is the motivation behind our practice? So even though the faith or the shraddha, it may be tender in the beginning, in the sense that one can still be distracted from focused practice. I'm sure we've all got that experience, or most of us have that experience, that we can still be distracted from focused practice. And at times we may be haunted by our material conditioning. But still, when we do practice, we're practicing with a specific purpose in mind. That's to please Krishna, or at least attempt to, and make progress in that direction. Now, obviously, the only person who can really judge that, apart from Krishna, is ourselves in our own self-reflection, looking into our own hearts, and maybe elevated sadhus also. But you know, we know our own hearts. That's why it's good to reflect from time to time and be quite thoughtful in our practice. But also hearing from those who are further along is extremely beneficial also. Because as we know, by the grace of hearing from sadhus, or hearing the scripture, we can understand that the motivation of our practice needs to be refined. You know, that for those of us with cluttered hearts, that means making our practice more steady, you know, having this interim goal of nishta, as our Guru Maharaj often points out, should be an interim goal for those who haven't attained nishta. And knowing that this nishta bhakti, that such steady bhakti, this also will help us fully unclutter our hearts in the context of wanting to go the full distance to prema. So hearing the spiritual ideals, this gives us great motivation or great reason to do so. After all, Krishna is all attractive. You know, that's the meaning of his name, or one meaning of his name. And we see in these examples of Rupa Goswami that he gave of mixed devotees, they were all attracted upon either seeing Krishna or hearing about Krishna, even though their initial motivation, it was more of a selfish one. That was their initial motivation. But by hearing more and more, their conception was refined, or their desire was refined, so to speak, and they all became pure devotees. So with that, I guess the direction I want to go now with the rest of the discussion for today is to give an example of refining our desire. Let's read the next verse before we discuss it. So the next verse is 1-22, and it says, Rupa Goswami says, "How can the happiness of bhakti arise in the heart when the witch of desire for enjoyment and liberation remains there?" So many of you will be familiar with this concept of yukta vairagya, or engaging even our desires for enjoyment in Krishna's service to make progress, to dovetailing, so to speak. You know, this obviously there are other meanings to yukta vairagya on a higher platform. You know, it's not that you know, devotees in bhava, even if they're engaging in yukta vairagya, they're engaging their material desires. That's not what's happening. Rather, they're engaging the material energy, understanding that it's all Krishna's energy in Krishna's service. But sometimes, you know, especially in early stages, we might have certain material desires or material inclinations, and we want to engage those desires for enjoyment, even in Krishna's service, to make progress. So this is one way we utilize this yukta vairagya, or dovetailing. So we might come back to that in later sessions, in regards to this, how we dovetail material enjoyment and like that. But in the context of refinement for today, I want to focus on this concept of liberation. So this term going back to Godhead that we've all heard many times, I'm sure, going back to Godhead, right? And it's usually emphasized very early on. And Srila Prabhupada himself used it extensively, as we know, in his preaching campaign and his purports. And I know there's a whole history to the origination of the phrase that it actually means something differently. There's a nice article on the Harmonist you can find there if you search back to Godhead. But that's another discussion. That's not what we're getting into today. But undoubtedly, most of us have heard this time and time again, this idea of going to Godhead, and this concept being, going to the spiritual world. Like our whole practice is about going to the spiritual world, right? So do we want to go to Godhead? Do we want to go to the spiritual world? Doesn't that seem like a desire for liberation of some kind? Surely we're not practicing Uttama Bhakti if that's our desire. And so that's not what I'm saying, but it's a rhetorical question. So this is one of those areas where refinement of understanding and desire is really important, I feel, as we make progress. I remember early on, I heard a class from a devotee. He was making a point that I thought was a very good point, actually, as I reflect on it, that if we were to enter the spiritual world now, he was speaking about the spiritual world, and he was saying that if we were to enter the spiritual world now with the consciousness we have now, what would we do with all those kalpavriksha trees, right? I know personally these wish-fulfilling trees. So there's said to be kalpavriksha trees in the spiritual world, or wish-fulfilling trees. You stand underneath and all your desires are fulfilled. So personally speaking, I likely stand underneath there thinking of all the things I could enjoy. So all sorts of flavors of ice cream, let's say, sweets galore, a tongue and stomach that are never satiated, so I could enjoy all that ice cream that I'm desiring. The list could go on. But of course, that wouldn't be coming from a selfless attitude or a desire for Krishna's enjoyment. And it's quite a crude understanding of the spiritual world, actually. But I remember hearing that in the early days, and I thought it was quite a nice point. But as we learn more and we hear more, and we understand more about what Vraj means, for example, what Vrindavan means, to some degree, of course, because to really understand there, we've got to go there, as we know. But to understand the nature of the Vrajbasis, we can understand that's the kind of association we want, that we want that kind of association. I once heard a class from my Guru Maharaj. He gave the example that it's not selfish to want to be like Mother Teresa, in the sense of Mother Teresa was known to be a giver. She was known for her charitable works, and so she was known for being a very giving person. And so if someone has that desire, I want to be like Mother Teresa, that's not a selfish desire. To want to be like that. Now, that's obviously presuming it's not because we want to do it superficially, because we superficially want to seem to be givers, because actually we want status or praise or whatever it is. Obviously, that's another thing. But if our desire is, okay, I'm not really that much of a giver, or I'm not, at least not on that level of a giver, but I really would like to embrace that kind of ideal, of being a giver like that, like Mother Teresa in this example, for example. That's not a selfish desire to have. And so similarly, to want to go to Godhead, let's say, to want to go to the spiritual world, to want to be part of the spiritual world, to be part of Vrindavan and like that's not a selfish desire, actually, if we understand what it is. And to go to the spiritual world should certainly be encouraged, because what better association is there than the residents of the spiritual world, and especially of Vrindavan? What better state of consciousness to strive for? And so this is another reason why hearing about these things, like the Leelas and these kind of things, is also so beneficial also. It creates impressions and desires in ourselves to be in such company and to develop such qualities. So in Vraj, as we know, there's no selfish desire at all, even spiritual selfishness. But if someone has a conception that to go back to Godhead is more from a sense of being liberated for one's own enjoyment, or to be able to take advantage of those kalpa-vriksha trees free of material suffering, then I'd say that some more refinement is needed to really embrace the sense of Uttama Bhakti that Rupa Goswami is giving. So that said, let's look at it from another angle, this sense of liberation. That, should we be completely free from the desire for liberation? Even though maybe we're not quite there in terms of really desiring the mood of Vrindavan. We might have heard about it, and in one sense we have. Maybe we've got some kind of like drive for that, but maybe it's not that strong, still, as we know, maybe some material conditionings there, and we also have desires for other things and whatever. So, still this desire for liberation, should this be just given up, even though we're not quite there? Because as many of you may be aware, one of the characteristics given in the first chapter of Bhakti-rasamrita-sindhu is that one characteristic is that there's a total disregard for liberation. So this includes even personal forms of liberation, which are only taken by the devotee if desired by Krishna. So there's a verse, I won't read it now, just in the interest of time, but there's a verse along the lines that even if a form of personal liberation is offered, then the pure devotee won't accept that kind of liberation unless it's desired by Krishna himself. So I don't intend to go through the 6 characteristics of bhakti in detail, but for the benefit of those who are not familiar, there are 6 characteristics of practicing Uttama Bhakti that have been given in the first chapter, or the first wave. And so those are that one who practices this Uttama Bhakti, by the practice of this Uttama Bhakti, it destroys all suffering. It also brings all auspiciousness. It has a total disregard for liberation. It's rarely attained. It's composed of supercondensed bliss, and it has the power to control Krishna. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, I think I'm kind of practicing Uttama Bhakti, or I've got this conception, but I know I can't control Krishna, and not that we should be trying to control Krishna, but also, I'm not really experiencing super condensed bliss, but actually, Rupa Goswami splits these different characteristics into the different stages of bhakti. So these last 2 of super condensed bliss and the power to attain Krishna, these are actually in the stage of prema. And to go to the first one, the first 2, this destroying all suffering and bringing all auspiciousness, this comes in sadhana bhakti. So as another side note, if you're wondering, okay, I practice sadhana bhakti, but all my suffering hasn't disappeared. I still suffer sometimes. So even though I've taken up this path and I think I'm sincere, at least I think so, maybe I have to look a bit deeper in my heart, but actually don't be too disheartened. Rupa Goswami points out that this happens gradually through the various stages of sadhana. And there are various examples given of different types of karma and so on. And Jiva Goswami gives a really nice example in one of his commentaries to one of the verses of stringing a needle through a bunch of leaves while stringing a garland. That, if we were to make a garland, those who are familiar with making garlands, or if you just imagine you've got loads of leaves and you've got a needle and you're threading them through the needle, it might seem, if you've got just a few leaves together and you put the needle through, that it's going through all at once. But if you were to film it, let's say you film those leaves and you put it in slow motion, you'd see the needle going through each leaf one by one. So the point made there in that section is that these statements that say karma is destroyed instantly, and these things, it's understood that different types of karma are destroyed one by one, and gradually in the various stages. So obviously in higher stages of sadhana bhakti, more of that material conditioning is gone. As we know, nishta, one isn't affected by the material conditioning, whereas prior to nishta, maybe we are being affected by a material conditioning in different ways, or karma. So there's a whole discussion on that. As I say, that's not really, that may be a good series for the future, but that's not for this series right now. But there's a nice discussion in the first chapter of Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu. And also Guru Maharaj has commented on these ideas in our Guru Maharaj in his Bhagavad Gita commentary in verse 256. So anyone who's got our Guru Maharaj's Bhagavad Gita, if you look at the commentary to 256, some of these ideas are brought out there also in his commentary. So that said, as I say, this destroying of suffering and bringing all auspiciousness, it's only included in the sadhana bhakti stage. So this idea of disregarding liberation, to bring back to the discussion at hand, that this idea of disregard for liberation, actually it's there at the stage of bhava. And that's because someone in that stage of bhava, they're already liberated. They've tasted something far beyond liberation. Sometimes it's said the bhava bhakti is bhakti proper or mature bhakti. And so it is the liberated stage. You know, there's no liberation is disregarded because it's seen as a small thing. It's seen as a side effect of bhakti. You know, it's not a big deal for someone who's tasted that, right? But it's not expected that one in sadhana bhakti will genuinely have a real disregard for liberation in the fullest sense. We all know what it feels like to feel the sufferings of the world. And this is why even the concept of going back to Godhead can feel so appealing, even when we don't have much understanding of what that means. I really like, there's a nice example Padmanabhan Maharaj sometimes gives in his classes, when talking about this disregarding of liberation, that if Mukti Devi was standing there directly in front of us and she was offering us the instant freedom. So she says, I will give you instant freedom from all the sufferings of the material world, and maybe even in a personal form of liberation. You know, you can go to the planet of the Lord or whatever. There are four types of personal liberation, but you know, I can give you this, all the sufferings of the world completely gone. You'll be very blissful. You'll be Vaikuntha, and no anxiety, right? No anxiety. Who knows if we'd really be able to resist such a temptation, even with all the theoretical knowledge we have? Yeah, we're not after liberation. We're not after liberation. You know, who knows? Who knows? But as I say, realistically speaking, in this stage of sadhana bhakti, it's not expected one will have a full-blown disregard for liberation, because that's something that comes naturally to someone in bhava bhakti. So although we may not be fully free from a desire for liberation, we can dovetail this desire in Uttama Bhakti. We're not practicing for liberation, as we've been discussing. So the desire for liberation itself is material, in the sense it's wanting to be free from material suffering, right? That's why someone wants to be liberated. There's suffering in the material world and they want to be free from that suffering. But as we know, all things material can also be engaged in the culture of Uttama Bhakti, this Yukta Vairagya. So we can refine that desire by praying. So we can pray, you know, please, Lord, liberate us from those obstacles that stand in the way of steady bhakti, nishta bhakti, those things that, you know, coming into my face time and time again and distracting me, and these things, you know, please help me be liberated from those things, liberated from those obstacles to stop us from gaining a taste, a deep taste, or ruchi, and help us become attached to you, a shakti. So many of the songs of our acharyas have these kind of moods, and they can help us meditate on these moods. The one that comes to mind for me is Prema Bhakti Chandrika by Srila Narottam Das Thakur. Is very beautiful, and has many of these moods of, you know, I'm haunted or really being affected by this Tamingala fish of lust. You know, lust is hitting me left, right, and center. Please free me from that so I can make progress, and so on. And there are many beautiful sentiments in those songs. But I'm sure anyone who's heard so many of our songs of the Vaishnavacharyas, the Mahajans, and like that, there's so many beautiful moods that express this kind of feeling of please help me overcome, let me be liberated from these obstacles to really embracing this verse, this 1:11 verse of Uttama Bhakti. So I'll, again, going back to why it is that we're students, is that our bhakti isn't covered by a desire for liberation. We don't practice to let me be liberated, let me even have one of the personal forms of liberation. Well, I'll get to that in a second, but that we're using that desire rather for making further progress. We're using that desire to progress in this school. So our Guru Maharaj, he sometimes answers the question, how many lifetimes will it take me to go back to Godhead? Sometimes people ask that, right? How many lifetimes does it take to go back to Godhead? And he often answers, with the amount of lifetimes, it stops you measuring how long it takes to go back to Godhead, and just engage wholeheartedly in serving Krishna. Making the point that this is all about serving Krishna, whichever stage we're at. Sometimes it's said, even sadhana bhakti is also uttama bhakti in an immature state. So Narottam Das Thakur says that actually in his Prema Bhakti Chandrika. So we can refine that understanding and motivation by the grace of sadhus. And one way is the way that I explained also, in getting a better sense of what it means to go back to Godhead in our school. It's not a case of going there so I can be liberated from my worldly anxieties, wish for my chocolate bars under the kalpavriksha trees, and eat to my heart's content, because there's no indigestion there, and so on. But it's about being in the company of and imbibing the attitude of those devotees who fully desire nothing but to please Krishna. So that might be in the Leela, if we understand what the Leela is, and that's obviously something we're all learning, but also it may be in this world, depending on what Krishna wants. That's up to Krishna. So, as I say, one refinement, I'll finish up in a second, but just one refinement is the hearing of our ideal and developing our desire for that. And on another level is also dovetailing or refining any desire for liberation we might have, due to not being in bhava and not being able to disregard it fully, especially in those really, hard moments in the material world when there can be a lot of suffering. But we can desire to be liberated from the anarthas that slow our progress. The things that we know are obstacles in our progress. We can desire and pray for strength to remove them, and engage in these angas of bhakti with a desire to have the heart cleansed of these things, as much as we can, and this will obviously increase and increase as we make progress. And so, there's many nice classes on Anartha Nivritti and these kind of things. Padmanabha Maharaj has a nice series. And also Ashram Maharaj gave a nice series recently on Sharanagati. So this really is, a big part of that. So I recommend listening to those also, in terms of transforming the frustrations of the material world in a way that we can develop our Sharanagati, and praying for the strength from those who are beyond these things, and obviously associating and hearing from those further along. This kind of refinement is really beneficial. And like our Guru Maharaj often says, I'll end on this, that our Guru Maharaj often says that it's not about becoming neurotic about these things. That's another important point. I'm sure anyone who's listened to his classes often will have heard this many times, that it's not about us becoming neurotic about these things and meditating on our obstacles, more than meditating on the holy name, let's say, or on transcendental topics. But when they are before our eyes, and when we engage in serious sadhana, as anyone who's engaged in any serious sadhana knows, these obstacles do come before our eyes. Sometimes it's not so comfortable, but when they do come before our eyes, that we use that desire of liberation, for example, to overcome them, that let me be liberated from these things, so that I can come to Nishta, and desiring to be liberated from our obstacles, knowing that the way is through the power of bhakti, because bhakti is more powerful than all these things. So I think I'll end there, because that's like 50 minutes already, I guess. So if anyone would like to add any comments or corrections or questions and like that, or refinements, then please do feel free to unmute yourself. I think you can unmute yourself. yourself, and then
Prabhu.
okay. I guess if no one's got anything, then
Haribo?
no, I can't hear. Let me see if I got my translation. I got mine on English. Maybe they need to put their interpretation on English.
Okay, does it work now?
Oh, there we go. Yes.
Sorry. I had to get off. Somehow or other, I lost the sound, so I had to get off and come back on, and I forgot to go through the interpretation button again. Um, First thing is, I want to thank you for your presentation. I was really um, I just really appreciate how well conceived it is, and how well and how concisely you delivered it. A good example for me, I think. Um, I don't have any corrections or anything, but an interesting note on the six symptoms of bhakti.
Mm,
When we look at the Sri Krishna Karshni in the Bhakti-rasamrita-sindhu, the power to control Krishna, to attract Krishna, Jiva Goswami makes the point that we're clearly talking about Sakhya Bhakti here, um,
mm,
because of the power to control Krishna in his commentary. However, in the Bhakti Sandarbha, he argues in the other direction rather elaborately. He points out, well, to kind of sum it up, he says that even sadhana, and he uses a bunch of verses from the Bhagavatam um, to substantiate this. That if sadhana bhakti has the power to compel Krishna to give the sadhaka bhava bhakti, that means that at least to some extent, even sadhana bhakti has some power to control Krishna. It's just a really interesting thing that I found because, well, I came across this after reading Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's commentary on the 19th verse of the 5th chapter of the first canto. This is Narada Muni speaking to Vyasadeva. And in his commentary, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur talks about one of the terms in the verse, rasagraha, which Srila Prabhupada um, renders as always remembering the taste that you got from serving Krishna. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur makes it really plain. Graha means haunted. And so he says this, that you can't get rid of that memory as if being haunted by a ghost that you can't shake. In other words, you're haunted by rasa. And he says it's from the very first day of worshiping the Lord. And he cites a verse from the second chapter of the 11th canto, one of the Navi-yogendras speaking to King Nimi. Very well-known verse, Bhakti Pareshana Pavo Virakta. So, he says that because the analogy in that verse is with eating. He says you start to get pleasure, nourishment, and relief from hunger from the first morsel of food, from that first handful of rice. So he says we can see from that so there's some bhakti um, and some experience of the Lord, even if it's like a nice kirtan or a good class or something like that, and some detachment from everything else, even from the very beginning of our practice. So that's just kind of really complicates the whole idea that it's got, that only sadhya bhakti, only prema bhakti has any power to control the Lord. And that comes from Jiva Goswami in the Bhakti Sandarbha, who is considerably more conservative in some ways than Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. But I just want to frame this again with my appreciation. This, even though I need to prepare to give a class myself in an hour or so, this was well worth my visiting today to hear this, and how nicely you covered this this part of the second chapter of the Bhakti-rasamrita-sindhu, and I have really good feelings about the future. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Maharaj. I really appreciate your feedback. That's really encouraging for me. I remember you quoting that about haunting us from day one when we met you in Poland, and it stuck with me a lot. I didn't remember the details of it, so that was really something I remember you speaking on that really stuck with me. And thank you for sharing that about Jiva Goswami's comments also. That's new for me. I really really appreciate that. It's hopefully one day I'll get to the Bhakti Sandarbha one day, but yeah, thank you so much for your encouragement, Maharaj. I really appreciate it. And also for your previous series on Sharanagati, I found it very nourishing myself. It was very beautiful, and more inspiration for us to keep walking on, right?
Right. Thank you.
So anybody else like to make any comment or ask anything? Or okay then. So thank you all for your time. Really appreciate it. And yeah, I look forward to being with you through the week when we can, and next week. And yeah, Hare Krishna.
Madana-mohana Prabhu ki jai.
Panchakalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhya eva cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha.